So we've heard from two great speakers so far, and I'm just as excited to hear about this next presentation. This session is entitled Cannabis for Epilepsy, Navigating Uncharted Territory. This session is generously sponsored by the Henry Ford Comprehensive Epilepsy Center. And here to facilitate today's session and make speaker introductions is a fellow board member of mine and a parent of a teen with epilepsy, Carla Boyd. Please join me in welcoming Carla.
Good morning, everyone. I did want to make a correction for Dr. Zilgett. I don't know if he's back in the room, but Dr. Zilgett did say that spending time in an EMU is not fun. I had the pleasure of spending 6 days with Dr. Zilgett in the EMU, and I think my daughter would agree we had a blast. So, fun with Dr. Zilgett. But thank you all for being here. As Steve said, I'm on the board of the Epilepsy Foundation of Michigan. And my daughter, Lane, is a 16-year-old with juvenile myoclonic epilepsy, and she is drug resistant. We are very happy that for the last year she has been taking CBD oil, and we celebrated 1 year grand mal seizure-free on September 20th. So I'm thrilled to be here to moderate this panel, and our panelists today include Dr. Gregory Barkley, an epileptologist and founding director of the Henry Ford Comprehensive Epilepsy Center. And Dr. Barkley is also the chair of the Epilepsy Foundation's Professional Advisory Committee and a board member. Dr. Jules Constantinou, a pediatric epileptologist with the Henry Ford Comprehensive Epilepsy Center and also a professional advisor for the Epilepsy Foundation of Michigan. Dr. Evan Litinas, Chief Medical Officer for Ohm of Medicine, a licensed medical marijuana provisioning center in Ann Arbor. And Ben Rosman, a cannabis lawyer and owner of PSI Labs, a licensed cannabis testing facility in Ann Arbor. So welcome, and thank you all for being here today to share your expertise. So to begin, can each of you start by briefly discussing your experience with this topic? And how about we start with Dr. Barkley?
Thank you. Thank you, Carla. I first want to say that as a board member of the Epilepsy Foundation since about 1994, I think this is the largest crowd I've ever seen at one of our annual meetings, and so it's very gratifying to see the turnout. My interest in cannabis started by listening to my patients and asking them what they thought helped to control seizures. Those that were initially bold enough to mention it started talking about cannabis helping to control seizures, and talking with other epileptologists after that around the country, including Orrin Davinsky, who's the lead author of most of the Epidiolex studies. It became obvious that there was something in the cannabis that helped control seizures long before Charlotte's Web became famous. Charlotte Fiji and Charlotte's Web oil became famous. So I have just kind of observed what people tell me that works and doesn't work to control seizures, and looking at the science has convinced me that this is a valid medication. In fact, there's probably dozens of anticonvulsant compounds in the cannabis plant, only a few which have been scientifically demonstrated in the rigorous fashion that leads to approval by medical authorities, but more on that later.
Thank you.
So, yeah, I guess I fell in. I don't want to say I fell into it but I think Dr. Zilgett spoke to us about the nature of epilepsy and how often epilepsy can be a devastating illness, and many times it can be drug resistant, and particularly when we see children who have the severe epileptic encephalopathies, the Lennox-Gastaut, the Dravet syndrome, We've done the circle of one drug after the other, after the other, after the other that many of you know about. And then there's been this buzz about medical cannabis, and a lot of families have naturally wanted to try it. And that's how I became involved. I think there's been some resistance from, so there's been a little resistance in the professions. Would you agree, Greg? Slight resistance, perhaps. And it has been difficult, I think, because, and I think Evangelos will talk to us about that, sort of how we navigate the network of artisanal products which aren't formulary. But certainly many families have tried it, and Dr. Barkley's told us about how it's important that your doctor listens to his patients, and I think Carla doesn't mind if I share, but Lainey has been through a difficult journey, and we've tried several medications to help control her seizures, and the CBD has made a difference. So it's a useful tool, and it's not useful for everybody. I think that's important to recognize. But we are learning more and more, and I'm excited that Epidiolex is now available, because it's a pharmaceutical product, and I think it's going to be exciting to see how it works for different children, for different families.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, first of all, the Epilepsy Foundation for putting this together, and everybody here. And thank you for everybody else being on the conversation here today. As far as I'm concerned, personally, I had migraines all of my life. I started cannabis. I used cannabis for the first time really age 31 while I was in medical school, and my migraine went away. And I started reading the medical literature and the historical data of why cannabis is a Schedule I medication, and what does that, the issues that comes with. So at age 31, I realized that cannabis is actually medication. And as I continue to educate myself on this, realize that cannabis is very safe. And now, like we said earlier, I'm the chief medical officer at a medical provisioning center, cannabis provisioning center in Ann Arbor. And we see a lot of patients, as far as epilepsy is concerned, we see a lot of patients that have issues with epilepsy, especially drug-resistant patients that, like physicians are saying right here, Dr. Constantinou, Dr. Barkley, that, you have some certain patients that you've gone through all the gamut of treatment, nothing works, and potentially cannabis is can be a very effective tool for patients and physicians to help with very difficult patients. And like Dr. Constantinou was saying, that it's not for everybody. There are side effects. There's, you have to educate the patient and educate yourself as a patient and as a parent and, healthcare professional on cannabis and how it's used. But overall, in what we've seen now, and we're also very excited about Epidiolex because of the how it's produced and how it's made, and I'm sure with PSI Labs here as well, we'll talk about a little bit about the recreational cannabis that is coming down the line, and how important it is for testing and having very, very high quality medications, and being under the state law. So cannabis overall, for me, what we've seen in treating patients can be a very effective tool for patients with epilepsy. You just have to educate yourself on how to use it, and how it's can be an effective, again, tool for both patients and physicians.
Thank you.
I think the first intersection in my life between seeing cannabis as a medical tool and my own epilepsy really was, I was working in criminal defense as a law clerk for Michael Comorn, a criminal defense attorney who specialized in medical marijuana defense. And I saw a lot of patients and caregivers come in who were very sick, sick folks who were using medical marijuana to treat their various conditions. And medical marijuana really helped them. And it was very impactful in their lives. And similarly, it had an impact on me hearing about how medical marijuana helped them. And that was the first time that I really saw that medical marijuana could make a difference. I was diagnosed with epilepsy when I was 19 in college, and I remember sitting with my neurologist, sort of learning about what epilepsy was. I think it was the first time I even heard the term. Learning about the do's and don'ts, what I can do, how it was going to impact my life. Alcohol was a no. Cannabis was a, I don't think that's going to make a difference. But that was so far back that we didn't know about the medical benefits. So much farther down the line, medical cannabis, I learned much more about it. Fast forward a couple years, and I went to law school. I got my license, and I saw there was a need for lab testing. There was only one lab at the time, and a friend of mine was getting a postdoc in chemistry, and he was an old friend, and so we decided it might be worthwhile to start a cannabis testing lab. And so we went on that journey together. It's been over 3.5 years now, and so we're a licensed cannabis testing lab in Ann Arbor.
Thank you, everyone. The entirely inappropriate federal designation of cannabis as a Schedule I drug has been a huge barrier both to research and access to cannabis as a treatment for epilepsy and other conditions. Additionally, the lack of a single coherent regulatory structure for cannabis has led to a confusing patchwork of products and providers. While recent changes have improved things significantly, patients and families have largely been left to try and navigate this landscape on their own. Can each of you describe from your perspective the evolution of medical cannabis and the surrounding legal landscape, how this evolution has affected people with epilepsy and other chronic health conditions, and what still needs to happen to ensure safe and affordable access to effective treatments? Mr. Rosman, do you want to start on this one?
Sure. So, I'm going to let you take it first and kick it off.
So the cannabis has been used as medication for 12,000 years, and it was first introduced into the New World probably by the Indians because there are pottery shards going back to 300 or so in Ohio and Ontario where the cannabis residues are found. But it was brought also over in 1545 by the Angolan slaves to Brazil, and then in around 1600 to the United States at Jamestown, Cape Cod, and in Canada at Port Royal, which is Nova Scotia. It was listed as on the 1850 Index of Approved Medications for Use in the United States called the USP, and remained on that list into the 1940s. So it was considered a standard medication. It was called cannabis, or the Indian hemp plant. It was used for a variety of uses, pain, seizures, and other things, all along until it became demonized in the late 1920s by the efforts of a man named Harry Anslinger, who was the head of the precursor of the DEA, who spent a lot of time in Detroit trying to chase down the booze smugglers during Prohibition. And Harry saw the handwriting on the wall in the late 1920s when the Prohibition was going to be repealed, and Michigan was the first state to repeal it. We were the hotbed of the booze smuggling. And he started writing these terrible racist, anti-immigration things about the evils of marijuana, which was an unknown word because it was a Mexican-Spanish slang term for cannabis. And it was kind of the equivalent of calling it pot, I guess, and nobody knew what he was probably talking about at first. So it was prohibited in the early 1930s, although it remained on the list of official drugs until the 1940s. And from that became all this hysteria about reefer madness and everything. And if you read about some of his quotes, you realize the nonsense that was promulgated that led to all this, a lot of the anti-scientific feelings about cannabis. Now we're 80-some years later, and we finally are emerging from this. And it's actually the approval of cannabinoids goes back in the United States by the FDA to the synthetic THCs compounds that have been approved about 15 years ago for nausea and loss of appetite in patients on chemotherapy or with AIDS. And then now this year with the approval of CBD by the FDA, and finally the DEA repealed the Schedule I listing of cannabis for Epidiolex brand CBD, but not any other CBD. So right now, Epidiolex is an approved drug. It's a Schedule V, which is for those of you who are familiar with more common drugs like Ativan or Valium. Those are Schedule IV. So it's the lowest level of scheduled drug just for that CBD compound, Epidiolex only. All the other CBDs are still considered Schedule I, just like any other cannabis product.
I'm glad I deferred to Dr. Barkley, because I think he just really, he took care of that really well.
So there is still a lot of stigma about artisanal cannabis, and I saw a patient in my clinic on Thursday, a little girl with Dravet syndrome, sweetest little girl you could ever see. She's a charmer. Anyway, unfortunately, she had one of her seizures the weekend before and it had been a focal seizure. It had gone on for 30 minutes, and she was staring, and her eyes were turned to the side, and she's on treatment with artisanal cannabis. Anyway, Dad was there, and he sort of lost it a little bit, and he had a vape pen. And this wasn't something that I'd advise, but he blew from his vape pen into the little girl's mouth. And then they went to the emergency room, and they mentioned this to the emergency room. So 3200 was filed. And
that's a child abuse form.
That's a child abuse form. And this poor family, Child Protection, went and visited the home. And so there's still a lot of stigma about the artisanal cannabis. So I think for those of you, I think it's always good to be discreet, is what I tell everybody. Don't tell your neighbors unless... and I think the challenge is going to be as we move forward and as with Epidiolex becoming available. So, again, Lainey, I'm going to use you as an example. I mean, Lainey's done very well on Haley's Hope. So the question is going to be, are we going to want to change from Haley's Hope to Epidiolex? And I suspect the answer is going to, Lainey's shaking her head no there. So... that sounds like a good decision to me. So, but those are the decisions that many of us are going to have to make: is do we stick with the product that we know, or do we need to change?
So there are a few things as far as like how cannabis has changed. Obviously, in the last 100 years or so, the history is obviously everybody knows. But at least for me, since I've been doing this for around 5 years or so. In these 5 years, what I've seen, the changes, first of all, is science. We have a little bit more science, but even the little bit that we have, we need so much more. So we're still lagging behind in scientifically, studies that are very high quality, especially on epilepsy, and cannabis is still sorely needed. What I have seen, though, as well, is that people start to realize that we have that, realize that more and more people are actually exposed to cannabis use, and they realize the effectiveness and how safe it is. And again, I always harp about educating yourself and being an educated patient. So the issue right now that I've seen is that we're still lacking in science. There's ongoing studies. More and more studies are showing that it's very effective medication for treatment of chronic pain, as an antiemetic for chemotherapy, and for MS spasticity. The issue is that, again, when it comes to seizures, we have some information from the Epidiolex studies, but overall, especially like you were saying, the artisanal type cannabis. We still need a lot of research. Having said that, a lot of patients still find relief, and it's very, very effective for them. So it's really a conundrum of how we proceed forward in a way that is safe and effective for our patients.
I just want to add a couple points. I saw an article this week that said only about 5% of Michigan physicians had filled out forms for medical marijuana. So it's fair to say that most doctors, this is not something that they have been willing to do, either because of fear of the liability or whatever. My guess is that neurologists probably have a much higher percentage, because I think in the epilepsy community in particular, there's a much greater acceptance that this is a medication that has a valid use. And now with the approval, you won't need a medical marijuana card to get Epidiolex, but I think that will further make it easier to talk about that for other syndromes. Now, there is an aspect of legal medicine that I think we need to bring out, and that is that because of the federal Schedule I status for marijuana, the group homes and other federally funded or regulated facilities have not been able to let cannabis in any form be dispensed. So if you have a relative who's in a facility, the only choice that you will have to be able to get cannabis is to have Epidiolex at this point. All the other forms will not, they will not let you administer it if the administration of the facility gets word of it happening. And so I think you need to keep that in mind. Fortunately for cannabis, it has a long enough half-life that it's a twice-a-day administered drug, or sometimes once a day. So administering in school can be avoided, but I think Jules is probably going to talk a little bit about that too.
Well, I think we've struggled a little with those issues as well in terms of camp discovery, in the sense that we've had to navigate whether or not we would be able to administer artisanal cannabinoids to the children at camp, and we had to make the decision that it was something that was very difficult to do with the current federal legal climate. So yeah, it is a very difficult decision. We face it at camps, we face it when kids go to school, we face it in the hospital when my patients come in and they're on treatment with artisanal cannabis. What do we do? And so those are all difficult questions.
Dr. Barkley, can you briefly review the science of cannabis as a treatment for epilepsy, focusing specifically on CBD, for example, why it's thought to have anticonvulsant properties?
So as I mentioned earlier, there are over 100 cannabinoids in the marijuana plant, and only a few of them have been rigorously scientifically studied. Most probably have various medical benefits. In terms of how they work, there are probably a half a dozen different mechanisms that have been identified as how the cannabinoids might influence body functions. I think that it's fair to say that for cannabis, as well as most other seizure medicines, they probably work by more than one mechanism in different patients or in different parts of the brain. One of the interesting aspects of cannabis is its role in influencing a particular receptor system called the vanillinoid system. And that is a system that's been identified that the receptor has to do with compounds that have a receptor that identifies structures that are shaped like the parent compound vanilla. Now, vanilla, we all know, is a very flavorful and pleasant compound that comes from the vanilla plant, and but there are some chemical cousins that have completely different properties, and the capsaicin that gives chili peppers their spicy hotness is very structurally similar to vanilla. So you think, wow, a couple little substitutions of a chemical structure, you go from a pleasant spicy thing to something, or a pleasant aromatic compound to one that's hot, and so these both bind to these receptors, and this receptor is distributed in the brain in the hippocampus, which has to do with memory, learning, and the propagation of many seizures, as well as temperature regulation. So we all know that when we've had spicy peppers, how it makes us feel hot and sweaty. So that the cannabinoid system works, one of its actions is through that. And this also has a regulation of anxiety. So when people talk about how cannabis makes them feel relaxed, and you read stuff about how it may be used for PTSD and veterans and other people with PTSD, as well as for for pain control, this is probably the mechanism that works for that. It may also have something to do with its role as an anticonvulsant, because the hippocampus is the pathway that many seizures propagate through.
Thank you. Dr. Constantinou, can you provide an overview of the findings from the clinical trials of Epidiolex? These trials have provided the most compelling evidence base for the effectiveness and safety of CBD as a treatment for epilepsy. If you can talk about the efficacy, side effects, and interactions, and also discuss the form the medication comes in and how you dose it.
Okay, so that's quite a lot. But I'll try and do it in 3 minutes. Epidiolex has been studied in Dravet syndrome and in Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, which are very difficult childhood epileptic encephalopathies, but actually most of the time these epilepsies do not remit, so there are adults with Lennox-Gastaut syndrome. So these medications have been studied in the way that new drugs are usually studied. It's a very rigid protocol, and I think Dr. Barkley is going to remark a little on how rigid the protocols are, but you're sort of locked into this schedule where you've got to build up doses of medication very quickly. So the medication comes as a syrup. It's strawberry flavored is what I've been told. And it's got little sugar. So if you're on ketogenic diet, you can use the syrup. And it's about 100 milligrams per ml. So the doses that we give are either 10 milligrams per kilo or 20 milligrams per kilo. And these are very big doses in comparison to what we're used to from the provisioning centers. So these medications are usually studied as an add-on protocol, and we compare to placebo or sugar pill. And what we look at is we look at the improvement in seizure freedom. So if you look at Dravet syndrome, in the study in Dravet syndrome, these were kids that were having and remember Dravet syndrome, these are children who have a sodium channelopathy, long seizures. So these kids were having about 12 long, prolonged convulsive seizures a month, and the average reduction in seizures was to about 6 seizures per month. So that's a worthwhile improvement. Similar numbers in terms of when we look at drop attacks and Lennox-Gastaut syndrome. In the studies, these children children and adults, I shouldn't just say children, were having about, I think 80 drop attacks a month. And again, there was about a 40% reduction. And when you ask families, was this worthwhile, they were asked to rate. So, most families thought that there was a worthwhile reduction. How many children became seizure-free? It's like, if you look at these studies, the average number of medications you're on 3 medications. You've tried 5 or 6 or 7, sometimes up to 26 medications before. So you're adding yet another drug after trials of many, many others. So these are good medications. And sometimes, people will say, well, doc, I've tried this, I've tried this, I've tried that, I've tried that. You really want me to try another medication? And I think it's always worth trying because Dr. Zilgert spoke about the risk of SUDEP, or sudden unexpected death in epilepsy. And if we look at these drug studies, we know that trying a medication, just trying to control the seizures better, helps reduce the risk of SUDEP.
So I know it's always difficult to think about trying another medication, but it's always worth trying. The side effects were the side effects you'd expect. Sedation, tiredness, sleepiness, diarrhea. And remember, sometimes it's not just the cannabidiol itself, but the company that it keeps. So, you know, the two most commonly used medications for Dravet syndrome and Lennox-Gastaut syndrome are valproate or Depakote and Onfi. And those medications, so there is an interaction, particularly with Depakote and Onfi. The main side effect is increase of liver enzymes. It's usually not dangerous, and it only needs to necessitates withdrawal of the cannabidiol in a very few patients. But we do recommend that we monitor liver function tests, and sometimes the reduction in liver function tests, if you cut back the dose of Epidiolex, you can continue treatment, and the abnormality of the liver function tests goes away. Greg, did you want to say something about the...
Sure. Actually, with Depakote and Epidiolex, the liver enzyme increases were only seen on those who were at 20 milligrams per kilogram per day, the highest dose of Epidiolex, along with Depakote. And the other at lower doses of Depakote, it wasn't an issue, and it was reversible. So I think that's we see changes in liver enzymes and many other kinds of drug interactions. So that is something that doctors can do with the balancing of medication, which leads into the point I wanted to make, is that when the FDA approves a drug for seizures, the regimen is the same for all seizure drugs. You have to have people with a frequency of seizures that is counted for a 3-month period as the baseline, while all other medications have been kept the same, and the stimulations therapies, if they're on a VNS or the NeuroPace RNS, has to be kept the same, and actually has had to be the same for at least a month before entry. So these are people who are having seizures despite having one or more medications or other therapies, who have been on the same therapy for more than a month before they even start to count seizures. And you count seizures for a 3-month period to get a baseline seizure count. Then the new medication is added. It's added at one or more doses, more than one dose, and a certain percentage of people are on a placebo, because the FDA requires 2 trials that show that higher doses work better than lower doses, and that it works better than a placebo. So the companies are also under a time window. They've got 3 months to count seizures. They need to get the medication up to a dose they think is really going to work, or else if they go too slowly, they may not be able to prove that it works. So you have people that are on high doses of medicines because they're not having control of their seizures. You add another drug into the Dravet syndrome. They were already on 3 drugs at the time, so it's not surprising side effects happen. Now, that's not the place that doctors do, the way we add drugs when a drug is approved, because we have 2 goals: no seizures and no side effects. And we know that if you're already on maximum doses of one or more other drugs and you add yet another medication, you're likely to run into side effects. So clinicians will start at lower doses than the clinical trials. They will start and drive it up slowly and reduce other medications in the process. Is a very typical approach to adding medication. So when you go and read the package insert for any medication that says start here and go there, that's fine, because they have to say exactly what they did in the clinical trials. But in reality, every patient is different, and most doctors start at a low dose, build it up gradually, and try and taper away other things that weren't affected or are already causing side effects. The other point I want to make is this idea about add-on therapy. So the FDA says that if you do this and prove that a drug works by adding it on, that has to be called add-on therapy. In order to prove that a drug works as monotherapy, you have to do a monotherapy trial. And in a monotherapy trial, you have to take a seizure medication. Take a patient who has seizures and give them either one or more doses of a drug that you don't know if it's going to work versus a placebo. Now, who would volunteer for, if you had epilepsy, to be on a placebo and of no therapy at all for your epilepsy? And so most patients and most doctors consider monotherapy trials to be unethical unless you're in a very tightly controlled situation, such as an epilepsy monitoring unit. All the seizure drugs that have been proven as add-on therapy work in monotherapy. So the only people that are really driving the add-on therapy are the companies that are promoting medications when they have convinced somebody to do a monotherapy trial. So after you've developed epilepsy and you've been on your first drug, every other drug after that's add-on therapy anyway. So kind of ignore this issue of add-on therapy versus monotherapy.
So we'll talk a bit more about Epidiolex shortly, but we also wanted to discuss the many components of cannabis and their potential value in epilepsy and other conditions. Dr. Litinas, can you give a brief overview of CBD, THC, other cannabinoids, and terpenes, and what research has shown us in terms of their beneficial and harmful effects?
Sure. Also a very complex question. So just to small note from what we were talking just earlier, the other thing that we suggest our patients is, especially if you have other medications, to potentially separate the doses by 2 to 3 hours. Potentially for some patients that they have side effects or it's difficult for them, sometimes that's another strategy that the patient or the physician can potentially use to mitigate any side effects. But overall, as far as the THC and the CBD and the terpenes, the cannabis plant produces, like we were saying earlier, over 100 different cannabinoids and over 500 different compounds that interact really with our bodies. And we don't, again, coming back to the science, it's lacking. We have only really done some studies on THC and CBD, which are the two major cannabinoids. But like we said, we have over 100 different cannabinoids, and we don't really know exactly how they interact with our bodies and what is the potential therapeutic effect that they can have. So as far as the terpenes is concerned, another very important chemical family that has a very impactful interaction with our bodies and potentially can be very therapeutic as well. So these compounds are naturally occurring from the plant, depending on the type of strain or depending on how you grow the plant. You can have different levels of cannabinoids, or the genetics itself. The plant might produce more CBD or more THC or certain level of terpenes, and you can manipulate that plant to really, when you make an oil out of it, you have heavy CBD or heavy THC or heavy with terpenes or not. So all of these compounds are active compounds that can interact with our bodies. You have to be very cautious with them. They work on different receptors. For example, CBD and THC, for what we know right now, THC works on receptors we call CB1, type 1 cannabinoid receptors. Most of them are found in our frontal lobe, basically. That's where most of the psychoactivity comes in. Most of the CBD receptors are found in our lower body, immune cells, but they also are weak agonists of some of those receptors. So it's the interaction in the body is very complicated. Overall, what we say to our patients, CBD is non-psychoactive. Normally we start most of our patients with CBD, especially if we have epilepsy, especially if it's a young a pediatric patient or a geriatric, an elderly patient that have never used cannabis. Mainly we start with CBD because of the lack of psychoactivity and potential for therapeutic effects. THC also very important. Most patients require a little bit of THC. The one thing I would say, for example, to think about, okay, well, we know that CBD is very effective for epilepsy. THC, for example, can also be very effective. In the sense of, for example, we have some patients we talked about earlier about sleep and insomnia, and how a patient that has epilepsy, if they don't sleep throughout the night, potentially the next day, or if they have lack of sleep for several days, potentially they can have an epilepsy, or a seizure, I should say. So THC in those state, in that patient, very low doses at night, well, it can help the patient all of a sudden have 7 or 8 hours of sleep. All of a sudden you decrease the level of seizures. So it depends on how you approach cannabis and how you see it and how you manipulate the doses and the different ratios. Overall, again, cannabis is safe. If you read the medical literature by itself, THC, CBD, terpenes, all of these are compounds that the plant produces that interact with our bodies. The ratio between those compounds are very important.
Okay, so another question for you. In addition to seizures, people with epilepsy may have problems, as you mentioned, with sleep, anxiety, depression, pain, memory. Through selection of different cannabis strains, is it possible to address multiple symptoms at once?
We've seen it, and the short answer is yes. The key is, again, you have to be very systematic, very, very slow and methodical with the approach. You have to have good notes as a patient. So you can actually start after a month or 2 or 3 months of use and systematic kind of note-taking. Certain data is going to pop out for the patient when you look back at your notes. So you can use it in a way that is effective. In other conditions as well, a lot of chronic pain, a lot of for anxiety as well, CBD is very, very effective. Again, the key is to, as a patient, to have a goal, realize that this is another medication. It's not for everybody. It has side effects, even though the side effects are way less severe than some other medications. And you just have to be systematic with your use, realize what it is, how to use it, have good notes. This is the other issues that we see a lot of times with our patients is because of the regular physicians, especially chronic pain physicians or just general docs, are unable or unwilling to talk to their patients about cannabis use. It's a little bit difficult sometimes for the patients. So we always suggest to our patients that ideally everybody in the healthcare team should be on the same page. So we want our patients to talk to their regular physicians about their cannabis use. Sometimes it's difficult for them to do, but ideally everybody needs to be on the same page. And because cannabis, again, it can be very effective for a lot of different reasons, you know.
I wanted to add a couple points to what Evangelos said, and that is that when you take medication by itself, typically versus with food, usually when you take it with food, the absorption is decreased. The studies have shown that with CBD, if you take it with food, particularly a high fatty meal like a bad junk food meal, you actually get more CBD absorbed into your system. So that's a little twist of CBD therapy that is important to know. I'm not recommending going out to McDonald's. I'm a vegetarian, so, but high-fat foods, so maybe chocolate might be a good choice. So the other point that I wanted to make is that we know that from many studies of adolescents and that THC has been shown to impair learning, concentration, and school performance. And so while there's been a recent open label study in Canada of a high CBD, fairly low THC study in Dravet syndrome that was successful in 20 children, I would be cautious in young adults and teenagers and children of using any THC because it may impair learning and school performance.
Dr. Litinas, another question for you. Can you talk about the different routes of administration and their respective benefits and drawbacks in treating epilepsy?
Sure. This is the one thing that is so exciting to me as a healthcare professional who's working with cannabis. First is that it's very safe, and because of that, the patient can take control to a certain extent. And cannabis lends itself to a lot of different methods of administration. You can eat it. You can use it as a tincture, meaning oral mucosal, drops under the tongue, basically. You can inhale it if you can. You can use it dermatologically. You can use it as a suppository. When it comes to epilepsy, ideally we want to control any type of issues with just ingestion, maybe 1 or 2, maybe 3 capsules per day, depending on the dose on the patient. And then we use either a tincture or inhalation as a fast-acting medication, meaning I'll tell our patients, think about eating cannabis as extended release. It takes about 90 minutes to take effect. Maximum effect is 2 to 3 hours after you eat. Stays in your body for up to 6 to 12 hours. So ideally, we want to control any type of symptoms with just ingestion. And then if you start feeling stress, or you go to, a music venue and there's a lot of lights, and all of a sudden you feel, I feel a little bit nauseous, I feel a little bit photosensitivity, then you can use a fast-acting kind of approach, which is a tincture, for example. So you can have a little oil tincture with you, you start feeling nauseous, you start feeling a little bit off, you can dose yourself, and you basically up the dose as needed. So the short answer is that I think about ingestion as extended release, I think about inhalation or tinctures or mucosal administration, drops under the tongue, as fast acting but short duration. So as a patient, again, we start very slow. You pay attention to what are the symptoms, do you have any other side effects from your other medications. Slowly and systematically, you increase the dose, see what the number of seizures are, the control of seizures. The other way I use, especially the fast-acting medications, like a tincture, is post-ictally, after the seizure. A lot of my patients can use a fast-acting medication so they can come out of the seizure, after the seizure, I should say, a little bit faster, a little bit better control after the seizure itself. So it can be very effective. It can be very, very easy to use. You just have to, again, be systematic, educate yourself, realize that you can eat it, you can use it as an oral mucosal administration, you can inhale it. It can be very effective.
Ben, can you talk about the natural complexity of cannabis and the additional complexity introduced through the cultivation and processing, and why testing is so important?
Sure. So cannabis is an extremely complex plant, and it's really fascinating. There's hundreds of cannabinoids and terpenes like we've discussed, and what people are generally testing for are just a handful. So THC, for example, when someone's talking about a potency report or cannabinoid profile, is THC, CBD, CBG, CBN, THCV. But so for potency, THC, in a flower, we can see variability all the way from 34% on the high end to 4% on the low end. And someone's not going to be happy with that result, but the numbers are the numbers. And for terpenes, the concentrations can be all across the board as well. And these, it's a combination of nature and nurture, the genetics someone gets, as well as how someone's handling the plant. If there's pestilence, mold, mildew, yeast, that sort of thing. And when we're talking about pests, obviously folks are going to be using pesticides, ideally not harsh pesticides. Sometimes there's organic approaches people can take as well. I don't grow plants, so I can't speak to that as much. We're just starting to really get into pesticide testing in earnest in our lab. But what we're finding is 70% plus of what we're testing is failing at the state limits, which is pretty bad and pretty shocking. And folks that we're testing with are starting to get worried that they're not going to be able to stock their shelves with items that will just not be totally contaminated by pesticides. So if you take a flower that has pesticides in it, or even heavy metals, and then turn it into a concentrate using solvent extraction or hydrocarbon extraction, one of the different methods, you're going to concentrate whatever's in there. Garbage in, garbage out, right? So you're going to have a concentrated pesticide, which is something no one wants, obviously, but we see that as well. Using a solvent-based extraction method, if someone's not doing the method properly, or they don't take it out of the oven in enough time, there's going to be residual solvents, which is why we do a residual solvent analysis. There might be butane left over in the process, ethanol if it's an ethanol-based extraction. In extreme cases, there might be benzene, which is carcinogenic. So the state set limits on solvents as well. So through the regulatory system that the state just enacted, through the licensed, the MMFLA facility, the act that just transpired, any provisioning center like Ohm that sells anything, by the time it hits their shelves, it will have had to have been tested by a lab like ours. So for a flower, for example, it will have had to be tested for potency, pesticides, microbials, mycotoxins, moisture, water activity. Concentrates will have had to be tested for those things as well, residual solvents too. So depending on how you change the material, the matrix, from flour to concentrate or to an edible, you might be introducing some additional contaminants or concentrating them, which is a concern. As a patient, if you're getting something like an oil and you're using that as your medicine, you're hoping that you don't have contaminant in there. And folks bring us an oil for testing, and they just want to test it for potency. And they're not thinking, should I test this for solvents? Should I test this for pesticides? Not thinking that there's thousands part per million of ethanol in there, or butane, or pesticides. And patients don't and shouldn't have to take on that financial burden of testing, but people are, because their caregivers aren't. And a lot of provisioning centers haven't been doing that testing up until this point. So that's one of the great things about this regulatory system, is that now every single provisioning center is going to have to test everything before it hits the shelves.
I wanted to play off of that a little bit. In the summer of 2017, the state updated some regulations, which is what Ben was referring to. And there was a lot of uncertainty about exactly what they had proposed. And so the Epilepsy Foundation staff and many of the board members, Carla included, and myself, all went to meet or testify in front of the various meetings that the board held. And we had a number of messages that we made. One was the access to cannabinoids therapy for people with epilepsy, but also we made an important point of saying that there should be strong standards on quality and testing to make sure people who were taking this as medication knew exactly what was in it, that they weren't going to be contaminating their bodies with things that were harmful by not having a quality produced product.
Thank you. So back to Epidiolex. Epidiolex, as it's been said, was approved specifically for the treatment of seizures associated with Lennox-Gastaut syndrome or Dravet syndrome. Because these two epilepsy syndromes can include virtually every seizure type, it seems as if the FDA, with this wording, is essentially saying that Epidiolex is approved for the treatment of epileptic seizures. If this interpretation is correct, use of Epidiolex to treat other forms of epilepsy should be allowed and would not technically be considered off-label. With this in mind, Dr. Barkley and Dr. Constantinou, can you talk about what you expect in terms of insurance coverage for Epidiolex for people who have other types of epilepsy?
So let's define what label and off-label means. So when you look in the package insert for any medication, it will say indications. And it will say it's used for this, that, and the other thing. And those are established by doing those two studies that show that the drug works and it's safe and effective for what is being proposed for. Once a drug has been approved by the FDA, physicians are able to write for that drug for any reason whatsoever. But if you use it for things other than those indications, then you are using it off-label. As a pediatric neurologist, Dr. Constantinou writes off-label prescriptions for anticonvulsant drugs all the time, because when drugs are approved for treatment of epilepsy, they're typically first tested in people 18 years of age and older. And so all drugs that are used in children that haven't been studied in children are, quote, off-label, even though they're widely used for that purpose. It's, as a matter of fact, the FDA requires that even if you're only testing in anticonvulsant drugs in people over the age 18, you still have to provide data in your submission to the FDA of how the metabolism of this works in children because it's recognized it's going to be used in children as soon as it's introduced. And for Epidiolex, it's approved for ages 2 and above. So if you had a child who's a year and a half and you prescribed it, you're prescribing it, even if it's for Dravet syndrome, as off-label because it's not within the age tested. So off-label is something that is, you have to be cognizant of what that means. So any other use of things for anything else or any other epilepsy syndrome technically would be off-label, although the number of seizure types that are included in children and adults who have Dravet syndrome and or Lennox-Gastaut run the gamut of every seizure type you see in every other type of epilepsy. So we ran into this with clobazam, which is the brand name Amphi in this country, or Frisium elsewhere in the world, which, by the way, is now generic, so it should be less than $1 a tablet. So those of you who have high copays, you should celebrate that. So we know that we can sometimes ask insurance companies for uses for other things. Just this week, we have been writing our first prescriptions to the 5 pharmacies that have been identified across the country to be able to provide Epidiolex. And they are just as uncertain about how to handle this and get the prior authorization. So we don't know much about how that's going to be approved by individual companies. What I will say is my expectation is that some companies will be much easier to work with than others. I don't have any predictions about who those might be. I have gotten word just as of yesterday that 2 patients have already been approved. Both have Lennox-Gastaut.
And do you also expect that with the approval of Epidiolex that there will be a ripple effect with other forms of CBD?
At the last American Epilepsy Society meeting in December, there were a number of cannabinoids that were being that there were posters on of early phases of research. There is a synthetic CBD that's been developed. That means it wasn't derived from extracting from a plant, but it was synthesized in a chemical laboratory. It would be the same compound, it's just gotten in a different way. There are other cannabinoids that are also being tested as well. And we know, for example, that the company that makes Epidiolex sells a product 20 miles from here in Canada and in Europe, which is a 50-50 mixture of THC and CBD, but it's been approved for the treatment of pain and spasticity and multiple sclerosis and other conditions. So you're going to see in the next decade or so a number of different cannabinoids that are going to be researched. There are studies underway in the treatment of prevention of growth of brain tumors in anti-inflammatory conditions such as Crohn's disease and other things like that, because the cannabinoid system works throughout the body in many different ways.
Can you also share your thoughts on the discrepancy in dosing between Epidiolex and other forms of CBD?
So that's, and maybe Dr. Litinas might be better. So, I mean, the one thing that seems to have come out from the Epidiolex study, and Dr. Davinsky says this, is that if you look at one of the Lennox-Gastaut studies, there were 2 arms. So some of the patients were randomized to 10 milligrams per kilo per day, and some were randomized to 20 milligrams per kilo per day. If you look at what's called the median seizure reduction rate, what proportion of people got their seizures reduced by half, it's actually pretty similar. It's about 44%. If you look very carefully at the figures, there's, if you're looking at who becomes completely seizure-free, there's a few kids, there's a few patients in the 20 milligrams per kilo per day arm that became seizure-free. So there is a little advantage to trying 20, the bigger dose. A few more kids become seizure-free, but really not a lot of difference if you look at the 50% who got seizures cut by half. I think it was 37% in the 10 milligrams per kilo group
and 41% in the 20 milligrams per kilo group. Now, if you ask families, says which dose did you like better, and this is blinded, most people actually like the 10 milligram per kilo per day dose. And why was that? The kids felt better because there was less side effects. There was less sedation, less. So this is a situation where less is better. Now, is less? Like, when I get the bottles from the Ohm and I'm looking at the numbers because my eyes aren't as good as they used to be. So it's sometimes hard for me to read those numbers. I don't know. But I think these are much, much bigger doses than we're used to. So so I'm a little bit surprised, and I'm trying to think about it in my own head, is why do some people seem to respond to what's almost like homeopathic doses of the CBD? Maybe you can.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I agree. For us, how we approach a patient with epilepsy is we start very low, much lower doses than the Epidiolex, 10 milligrams per kilogram. The key is for us that we start very low, but again, because cannabis, the safety and the therapeutic index, you can, as a patient, systematically increase the dose until you can find the control that you require. So the other reason for us that we start very low is what we were talking about a little bit earlier, about that cannabis in a lot of ways is not tested as a pharmaceutical grade medication. So you have to be, another reason to be extra cautious is that a lot of the medications previously in cannabis medications, they weren't tested to the certain standards that the state now requires, which is excellent. So more and more patients will have the access to very high quality tested and clean medications in the future. So as far as the dosing is concerned, again, it's very interesting that, and most of the times that we see patients, in order to find better control of their seizures, they need higher doses, similar to what, Epidiolex found control with. But again, we start our very low, much lower doses, and slowly and systematically we increase the dose until we find the therapeutic dose for the patient.
Can I just interrupt? So if you look at the doses of seizure medications used in the United States and compare it to the doses of the same drugs used in Europe, American physicians and patients tend to be on much higher doses for epilepsy than they use in Europe. Why that is, I'm not sure. We also know that every patient is unique, and I am reminded all the time of a story one of my mentors, Ken Capon, told me of he had seen a patient who had come in on 15 milligrams a day of phenobarbital, which is a very small dose, and she hadn't had a seizure in 20 years, and he said, "Oh, ma'am, that can't be doing anything for you. Why don't you just stop that?" And she stopped it, and within a month she had her first seizure in 20 years. So one of the rules about treatment of epilepsy is if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And and I can remember when I first started taking care of patients with epilepsy, that I had somebody who was on a crazy combination of drugs, and she was doing fine, and I tried to scientifically adjust her doses, and I messed things up for a while till I got her back on a crazy combination of drugs that helped her become seizure-free. And I just want to give a little bit of translation of all this milligrams per kilogram to people who are in the audience. If you weigh 150 pounds, 20 milligrams per kilogram is about 1,500 milligrams a day, and 10 milligrams per kilogram is about 750 milligrams per day. Most of the products of CBD that are bought at dispensaries or overline as hemp oils are on the range of 10 to 25 milligrams per dose. So we are talking about the doses that are used in common practice through artisanal products are very small compared to the doses used in the clinical trials for Epidiolex. And part of the issue why people are on small doses is that it is so expensive. For the artisanal products, the last time I was on television, on one of the shows about cannabis, there was a police officer. He said to me, when I started on the force in the 70s, heroin was expensive and cannabis was cheap. Now heroin is cheap and cannabis is expensive. Why is that, he said. So one of my hopes, and I think we're going to get to this, is that with the legalization of cannabis, maybe the supply and demand equation works so that the price will drop a bit.
Thank you. I think we're ready for Q&A. We have a few minutes. 4 minutes.
So, quick question. Dr. Barkley, you already touched on the risks of cannabis use on the developing brain, but I would like to know if you had any thoughts on research that's remarkable on the endocannabinoid system.
So the endocannabinoid system is the cannabinoid system that's released on our own body. The cannabinoids that are used from plants are called phytocannabinoids. So the endocannabinoid system helps regulate us in many different ways. It basically helps us relax, eat, sleep, feel at ease. So you find endocannabinoids throughout the body. There are some anti-inflammatory effects, and it's one of the components of mother's milk, for example, is one of the endocannabinoids. The structures, the chemical structure is a little bit different than the ones come from plants, but they bind in the same fashion. So there, if you go onto a site, if you want to actually learn about what is going on with any product, I would suggest going to pubmed.gov, where every scientific article that is published in peer-reviewed literature has an abstract listed, and sometimes the whole article is there if it's been funded by the NIH, so that will say free PubMed, and you can see the whole article. So you can type in cannabis or CBD, probably not CBD because it's an abbreviation, but cannabidiol or THC or anything like that, and either as a single word or epilepsy or Crohn's disease or whatever you want, and you'll be able to look for yourself and try and find the literature so that you can try and help make up your own mind.
I have a question regarding panic attacks or anxiety on CBD. Is there any connection with that? Because our daughter had seemed to suffer severe anxiety and panic attacks when she was put on CBD. So I don't know if there's any correlation or if it was just a coincidence.
It's very difficult to say. Again, like we were saying earlier, every patient is different. For us, what we see for the most part is, so this is the one thing you have to think about is the biphasic nature of cannabis as a medication, which that means that at certain doses, one medication does one thing, at a higher dose does something else. So that's the one thing you have to think about when you use cannabis. The other thing is, again, each individual patient is an individual patient. For us, most of the time, CBD is actually a very effective medication to decrease anxiety, especially the fast-acting medications like a tincture or like an inhalation, because as soon as you feel a little bit of anxiety coming on, you can dose yourself and calm yourself down. So I'm not 100% sure. I mean, I've had a few patients that CBD actually gives them energy, not necessarily anxiety from what I can remember, but it's more of like a daytime medication for them. It's very energetic and uplifting. Most of the time, CBD for patients is more relaxing, anxiety reduction. But I'm not seeing that that's not possible for a patient to actually get anxious because of their endocannabinoid system and how cannabis works in their body. So, again, caution. You start slow and methodical. Write everything down. Like any other medication, be cautious when you start using it and pay attention to side effects.
CBD definitely energizes me, and it's never worked as a sleep aid. It keeps me up all night, so I can't take it before bed. So I can't speak to anxiety, but it keeps me up and sort of wound up all night long, which is not great for epilepsy.
I have a couple comments on that as well. So, first of all, I would wonder if the compound that your daughter got had actually CBD and THC, because it's well known that you're more likely to have panic or anxiety with THC than CBD. The second is that, as anybody who's treated a child with anti-seizure medications knows, is that even though drugs will say that this caution may cause drowsiness, that sometimes drugs have paradoxical effects on individual patients. And so a sedative like phenobarbital, for example, may make a kid hyperactive, and drugs that are stimulants are used to slow kids down with ADHD. And why do they do just the opposite of what you would expect them to do in certain medical conditions is a mystery, but it's a well-recognized observation.
Hello. Thank you very much for your presentation. I have complex refractory epilepsy in my right temporal lobe, and I'm eligible for surgery, and I've had everything from MEGs to PET scans and everything else. I'll have a new physician, a new epileptologist at Michigan Medicine, and we're going to be talking about Epidiolex. My question is about interactions. I'm currently on Onfi. I'm over the FDA limit on Topamax and also Vimpat. You mentioned interaction with Onfi, which clearly has side effects if you withdraw from it. And I'm curious about if there have been studies about interactions with Vimpat and also Topamax, because I've been on that regimen since I've been seeing Dr. Smith for, basically since he stopped practicing. So I'm curious about that because we're now exploring a change in medications. So curious if there's been studies done about, interactions on the other two medications and what would happen with any change in Onfi.
Well, I'm sorry to hear you have had such hard to control seizures. A couple thoughts. One is that besides medication, there are some neurostimulation options with the NeuroPace and soon-to-be Medtronic device, and even the vagus nerve stimulator. If you haven't tried that, those are all options to consider. The interaction with clobazam, which is Onfi, is that it increases one of the active metabolites of Onfi. So one of the strategies that you can use with adding CBD to Onfi, patients on Onfi or clobazam, is to cut the Onfi. The interactions with other drugs, other seizure medications, are not very significant, other than the fact that you're adding medication onto other drugs. And so if you're on 3 drugs and you add a 4th drug, doesn't take Einstein to figure out that you may feel over-medicated. And so that's part of the art of medicine, is trying to decide, when you talk with your doctor, which drug do you think is helping you the most, which is causing the most side effects, and how are these drug interactions. So that becomes part of the complex decision-making that patients and doctors have to kind of work through by bouncing ideas off each other.
Hi there. Thank you for this presentation. The question I have is, my daughter has autism, and I was wondering if you could speak to dosing for autism with cannabis in general, but more specifically if they have any lessons learned.
So
certainly, my experience with the use of cannabis products in autism is relatively sort of not that advanced, because up until recently it was not an approved condition. So it's only recently been approved for use in individuals with autism. But having said that, I have a few patients, autism and epilepsy are often associated. The association is one of the things that brought autism out of the realm of, in the old days, if your child had autism, they'd say that was because you were refrigerator parents and you didn't know how to give love. And when we began to appreciate that seizures are overrepresented in children with autism, that's sort of how we learned that there is a neurological basis. So certainly some of my patients with both conditions with autism and epilepsy. Sometimes the CBD hasn't helped that much with the seizures, but it's actually helped with behaviors. And I think of one girl in particular who would come to my office and she would pace and hit her mum and wouldn't sit still, and she wanted to leave. And now we started the CBD. She's, hi, how you do? Well, you know, she wants to sit down. And so I've seen dramatic responses. Now, my question, and what I don't know, so the question is, what's effective? Is it CBD? And empirically, I'm thinking maybe a more THC-weighted product might be beneficial in terms of the anxiety, the obsessive-compulsive, and the behavioral dysregulation. So I think I'm still learning, and I think you might...
We have a few patients with autism, especially like Dr. Constantinou was saying. Recently, the state passed autism as one of the qualifying conditions to get your medical card. So we do see a lot of young people with autism. Again, for us, for some patients, it doesn't work. We don't see a lot of change. For a lot of patients, though, with autism, this is what we see as well, is change in the mood. The patient, all of a sudden, when they speak to the child, actually pays attention. It follows your eyes. You know, they hear their name. Their self-harming behavior goes down. But again, those are individual from individual to individual. The level of control of the symptoms is different. So again, our philosophy is we start very low, we're systematic with our use, pay attention to what's going on. You know, for example, we saw earlier, if you use a tincture, which is oral mucosal administration, it takes about the maximum effect you're going to feel is about half an hour to an hour after administration. So we tell our parents, for example, pay attention, what is the behavior of the child now when you give them the medication? What is the behavior half an hour to an hour later, you know? So you start getting information on what is an appropriate dose, you know, what are the results, can we use ingestion and sublingual administration at the same time? The different ratio between the CBD and the THC is very important. But overall, the strategy is you start slow, methodical, you realize that the CBD to THC ratio is very important, method of administration is very important, and having a good notebook as a patient or a caregiver is very important. So again, systematic, slow and methodical use, educate yourself on cannabis, and you know, for a lot of patients is very effective.
All right, thank you so much to all of our panelists for a fantastic discussion.